Bring in Lihle Ngcobosi into the conversation, political analyst, to take it forward with me. So you saw for yourself a bit earlier on there, they're going to have dinner, but you can tell what's already on their minds. Just your reading of the tone of the conference around this question of leadership. My sense is that the horse trading is intense and has reached fever pitch.
Definitely. I think we are now officially in conference season, or rather the conference itself has really come into action now, considering the fact that some slates have emerged quite clearly. Rumours around the centre have shown that particular slates have emerged, and as well as individuals have been identified from the different provinces, and people who are now able to make concessions between positions and concessions between who their candidate might be for whatever position. And so these are becoming quite apparent and quite clear. I think what is interesting, specifically around the debate, or rather the amendment of the splitting of the deputy SG, I think part of the reason that, we've been hearing that the lack of gender representation is probably one of the reasons why they decided to split this. And I think part of the issue is that the weakened ANC Women's League has contributed to this, to say if we had a strong enough Women's League that was able to firstly lobby for their particular candidate, they haven't been able to do that this year or in the run-up of this elective conference. And so the gender question, I think, not only falls primarily on the party, but it also falls on the Women's League as well, to say they haven't been able to present a candidate for themselves. And I think, of course, issues have emerged this year with the Women's League, but I think in the 2017, when Ramaphosa was quite a clearly identified candidate, the Women's League had quite a strong arm in that, and the margins between then Cyril Ramaphosa and, of course, NDZ weren't as stark as they probably will be now if she does emerge from the floor. So the gender question, I think, is quite critical here. But most importantly, we are seeing that there might be the potential of zebra slates that are emerging. I don't necessarily think there'll be one particular slate that emerges, which then the question will be, how then do these two slates then work together should they want to be part of the incumbent in 2024?
So the question you raise around gender representation is a crucial one, because as you rightly say, even Batabile Dlamini has been candid enough to say, we didn't have that united force that said we're a political force in the ANC and you are going to take us seriously in terms of sticking to the ANC's 50-50 gender representation policy. Although, of course, there's that debate of whether or not the officials, the top six, are a structure or not, but certainly no question that the representation should permeate even at those levels. And I think I don't know what you think about the DSG role. I've just been perturbed as an observer of politics about how the deputy secretary position, it's one way or another, it's almost like it's now reserved for women.
Yes.
Whether it's Deputy Secretary General at national level, Deputy Provincial Secretary, Deputy Regional Secretary, Deputy Branch Secretary, you are more than likely in a slate that's dominated by men to see a woman almost automatically. As we speak right now, Phoebe Potgieter is the name that is being raised there. Nomvula Mokonyane raised in that context. These are women who are more than capable, who have shown that they've been part of the ANC leadership all these years.
It shows us that the bar form within the ANC is quite high, right? The standard to which they've been held to be able to be deemed as people that are qualified to occupy quite senior positions is quite high, whereas for the men it's not necessarily a standard that is as highly applied to them. And so that gender disparity in terms of how big man politics play out within the party, but also in governance as well, does show us the ANC has not been able to take seriously the gender dynamics of the party and how they participate. And in many ways, they continue to sustain this idea that all national liberation parties fall around this idea of being extremely gendered, and that all liberation movements across the board, whether it's on the African continent more generally, do have that issue of not being able to deal with the gender question and deal with it properly and deal with it in a way that is quite reflective of the demographics within the party. And so the organization has really failed, I think, has failed the women in the ANC, but I also think the women in the ANC themselves, in some regard, have failed themselves in that they haven't been able to they haven't been able to sort of take to task the patriarchal dominance within the party. In some instances, you find that the only way that they could have some sort of power play or power negotiations is if they do attach themselves to the big men in the party. And that plays out.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note, though, Lihle, just before we move away from this issue of gender, that Jessie Duarte, before she passed away, in a way, carried the organization in as far as the Secretary General's office is concerned, and that's the engine of the ANC, in both capacities at that point, because she was Deputy Secretary General, but in the absence of Ace Magashule, became the de facto acting Secretary General. Let's go back now and talk about once that issue of whether or not to adopt this constitutional amendment is dealt with and the nominations are done. How big a factor is what is happening outside of conference going to be? You're seeing a lot of commentary from people, some of whom are not at conference, certainly those that support former President Jacob Zuma, that are saying this person, Cyril Ramaphosa, is now an accused person who should step aside, who should not be eligible for election. He has fired back, he being the ANC president, Cyril Ramaphosa, has fired back today through the state attorney's office. Those dynamics and the failure to talk directly to the para matter and the digital vibes matter in the organizational report, do you foresee them playing a role in what transpires when nominations are called for inside plenary?
I mean, definitely. I think if we were in plenary yesterday when the president of the party delivered his address, we heard, the shoutings of Phala Phala, Puma Phala Phala as well were expressed quite intentionally there. And so I think it is playing out in the political domain of the party. But I think the question is that will it have enough standing to be able to punish the president in such a way that he's not able to secure his second term within the party? But I think what is more interesting for me is that the ANC has created a tradition that, and an unspoken one at that, where the post-democracy, there has been no president that's finished 2 terms, right? And even if they show sort of the ability to hold the party and gather it, it becomes quite contentious when they sort of try to go towards the end of their second term. So I'm interested to see for Cyril Ramaphosa if this will happen to him as well, to begin
second term
in the state, but also second term within the party as well, to say, will the party then respond in the way that we've seen tradition play out? And I think that for me is very, very interesting, because we are aware that if he does fail to secure some kind of margin within the 2024 elections, there might be some punishment that comes his way.
Yeah. So Jacob Zuma did finish 2 terms in the ANC.
Yeah.
But the last few months has happened with former President Thabo Mbeki, the same fate with former President Jacob Zuma. But that's an interesting one to tease out going forward. Talk to me about, I don't know, to what extent have you been observing Gwede Mantashe? He's certainly one of the big stories of this conference, right? I saw this talk on social media that says every man needs a Gwede Mantashe in their lives, someone who's just going to come out and be the pit bull and go on the attack. And I raise this, Lihle, because it's interesting. Coming into conference, he certainly wasn't the runaway candidate for that position he wants to retain for national chairperson. Tomorrow morning, he's addressing a progressive business forum breakfast. But by then, the nominations will be done and dusted. I don't know if there will be elections in the sense that, will there be contestation for that position or what? But just talk to me about your observation of Gwede Mantashe's role in all of this.
I think he's quite an interesting political figure, I think, in South Africa, and specifically within the party as well, in that he's shied away from sort of the top 1, top 2 positions, has really been able to anchor himself in the organization specifically. Of course, he's part of the formal government, of course, but within the party itself, I think he's been able to really secure quite a very critical position, not only within the organization, but being able to attach himself to different become president of the party, and being able, like you said, to be that pit bull or that bulldog that protects where it is required. I mean, we saw him yesterday not being too impressed with what was happening with the KZN delegates and really sort of chiding them to say, you know, this is unacceptable. And I think it does play into his plan to say, I may not be number one or number two, and maybe there is a conversation to say, what are the power dynamics of not being one and two? And what are the interesting power plays and power moves that you can make within the organization with the particular position that he has held and the ones that he's gunning for now.
All right, Lihle, let's leave it there. We're completely out of time. That's just one of the multiple stories that we could pull out and tease out for you. But my time here is done for the evening. At the top of the hour, Power to Truth with Professor J.J. Dabane. You don't want to miss it because he will be getting direct responses to what has transpired in the last few hours. The president, through the state attorney's office, responding to former President Jacob Zuma's summons, which is aimed at getting the current president before a court of law on the 19th of January next year.